The first thing people noticed was how quiet the woods became when he preached. Birds fled. Wind stilled. Even the insects seemed to listen. The pastor said it was reverence, nature bowing to God's truth, but those who stood at the edge of the clearing felt something colder, like the forest was holding its breath. He spoke of purity as destiny, of obedience as love, and of sin as something that could be cut away if one had the courage to obey without question. After his wife died, buried beneath an unmarked stone near the trees, the sermons grew more intimate and more dangerous. He stood closer to the congregation, eyes shining, voice lowered to a hush meant only for the faithful. Her daughters were always near him then, pale figures in long dresses, their gazes fixed on the ground as if afraid it might open beneath them. Soon, he announced that God had chosen their paths. Sacred unions. Divine correction. No celebration, no witnesses, only vows spoken deep in the woods where no one else could hear them. When the girls began to disappear one by one, the pastor said they had been delivered into purity. He smiled when asked where they had gone. He quoted scripture when concern turned to fear. And at night, when lantern light flickered between the trees and hymns echoed from places no chapel should be, the town slowly understood a terrible truth. Whatever was happening in those woods was being called holy, and no one knew how to stop it. When the pastor first arrived at the edge of the woodland settlement, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about him, and that was what unsettled people most. He did not come with a congregation or announce himself with revival tents or loud promises. He came alone, dressed plainly, carrying only a weathered Bible and the certainty of someone who believed he had been chosen long before he ever stepped into the trees. The settlement itself was small, tucked between dirt roads and dense forest, a place accustomed to strangers passing through but rarely staying. The pastor stayed. He built a modest chapel with his own hands, positioning it where the woods pressed closest, as if the trees themselves were meant to be part of his congregation. His sermons began simply enough, focused on purity, obedience, and moral discipline, themes the townspeople had heard before. But there was a sharpness beneath his words, an insistence that purity was not a metaphor but a requirement, something that could be enforced and preserved at any cost. He spoke with calm authority, never raising his voice, never threatening, yet somehow leaving his listeners uneasy, as though they had agreed to something without realizing it. He claimed that the wilderness surrounding them was sacred ground, untouched by modern corruption, and that God had led him there to protect it and the souls within it. Over time, people noticed how the forest responded to him. Animals avoided the chapel during sermons. Sounds seemed to dull when he spoke, as if the woods themselves were listening. He encouraged isolation, urging families to turn inward, to distrust outside influence, to see the world beyond the trees as poisoned and sinful. His words did not inspire joy or hope but obligation, a sense that faith was something to be proven through sacrifice. Those who questioned him were met not with anger but pity, told gently that doubt was a symptom of moral weakness. Despite the unease he caused, the pastor earned trust through persistence. He helped with burials, counseled grieving families, and offered certainty in a place where life was already hard and unpredictable. His reclusiveness was reframed as devotion, his intensity as righteousness. Slowly, the settlement accepted him as a spiritual authority, not realizing that his vision of purity left no room for consent or compassion. By the time whispers began to circulate about his private teachings and the control he exerted over those closest to him, the foundation had already been laid, and the woods that once felt protective now seemed to close in, sealing the town inside the doctrine of a man who believed himself incapable of wrongdoing. The death of the pastor's wife came quietly, without spectacle, and in a place where quiet already carried too much weight. She was found ill one morning and gone by nightfall, her passing explained as a sudden weakness of the body, a trial sent by God rather than a cause for suspicion. The burial took place near the tree line, close enough that roots would eventually reach the coffin, and the pastor presided over the service himself. He spoke of obedience and divine purpose, his voice steady, his eyes dry, as if grief were an indulgence he had already surrendered. The townspeople noticed how quickly he returned to preaching, how seamlessly loss became lesson. With her gone, the structure of the household shifted. The daughters, who had always lived under strict rules, now fell entirely under his authority. He referred to them no longer as children but as vessels, entrusted to him by God after their mother's departure. In sermons, he spoke of guardianship as a sacred burden, of fathers called to stand in the place of both parent and prophet. What sounded abstract from the pulpit became concrete within the walls of the home, where prayers grew longer, silence more enforced, and obedience absolute. He began to claim that God spoke to him more clearly after his wife's death, as if her absence had removed a barrier between him and divine truth. Dreams became revelations. Thoughts became commands. He shared these visions selectively, hinting at them during sermons but saving their full weight for those closest to him. The daughters were told that their purity was now the family's offering, a living sacrifice meant to honor their mother's soul and secure their place in God's favor. Fear was reframed as reverence, resistance as temptation. Neighbors sensed something was wrong but struggled to name it. The pastor appeared devoted, tirelessly caring for the girls, shielding them from the world's corruption. He insisted on accompanying them everywhere, answering questions on their behalf, reminding others that grief required privacy. Any concern was gently dismissed as gossip or spiritual immaturity. In a community shaped by faith and isolation, his explanations were difficult to challenge without challenging belief itself. As months passed, the daughters grew more withdrawn, their faces hollowed by discipline and constant prayer. The pastor's sermons took on a new urgency, emphasizing bloodlines, inheritance, and the danger of impurity entering the home. His authority no longer rested solely on scripture but on tragedy, on the idea that loss had elevated him to a higher calling. By the time the town began to realize that he had become the sole interpreter of God's will within his household, it was already too late, because the man who buried his wife had also buried any boundary that might have protected her children. The rumors began the way they always do in isolated places, softly and without ownership, passed between lowered voices and unfinished thoughts. Someone noticed that one of the daughters had not been seen for days. Another mentioned that her window stayed dark at night, curtains unmoving. When questions reached the pastor, he answered calmly that God had called her into a sacred union, a private blessing too holy for public display. He said it with such confidence that even the most concerned listeners hesitated, unsure whether they had crossed into territory where curiosity itself was sinful. Soon another daughter vanished from daily sight. Then another. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: a brief announcement from the pulpit, a prayer offered in place of explanation, and a warning against gossip disguised as spiritual counsel. The pastor insisted these unions required secrecy, that true purity could not survive the contamination of witnesses. He framed isolation as protection, claiming that the world's eyes carried corruption. To doubt him was to doubt God's design, and no one wanted to be seen as the person who questioned divine will. What unsettled the town was not just the absence of the girls but the lack of ceremony. There were no celebrations, no visitors, no signs of new households forming. The supposed husbands were never named. No one saw the daughters leave with packed belongings or return with the marks of married life. It was as if they had stepped out of the world entirely, absorbed into something undefined and unreachable. When pressed, the pastor smiled gently and said that not all marriages were meant to be understood by those with untested faith. The woods became part of the story. People spoke of lantern lights moving between trees late at night, of hymns drifting through the darkness from places no paths led to. Those who tried to follow the sounds found themselves disoriented, turned around, or seized by an inexplicable fear that sent them home shaking. It was whispered that the forest was swallowing the truth, that whatever vows were being spoken there were binding more than just the missing daughters. As concern deepened, so did the pressure to remain silent. The pastor warned against meddling, reminding the congregation that divine work often looked monstrous to the unworthy. He spoke of biblical trials, of families tested through sacrifice, and of communities destroyed by doubt. Gradually, fear replaced curiosity. People avoided the subject altogether, pretending not to notice the empty spaces where young women once stood. By the time the town understood that the daughters were not simply married off but erased from communal life, the pastor's authority had hardened into something unchallengeable, and the question no longer was where the girls had gone, but whether speaking their names aloud would invite the same fate. The ledger was never meant to be found, which was why it was hidden beneath the pulpit, wrapped in oilcloth and pressed into a hollow carved directly into the chapel floor. It came to light only because a floorboard warped during a heavy rain, lifting just enough to reveal the edge of yellowed paper. The person who discovered it did not open it at first, sensing instinctively that some objects carried a weight best left untouched. But curiosity, once awakened, proved stronger than fear, and by candlelight the pages were finally turned. Inside were names written with deliberate care, each followed by dates, scripture references, and brief annotations in the pastor's unmistakable hand. These were not sermons or accounts of charity but records of vows, blessings, and unions performed in secrecy. Each daughter's name appeared once, written clearly, reverently, as if the act itself were sacred. Then came the markings that disturbed the reader most. Lines drawn through names, not hastily, but firmly, as though cancelling an obligation or erasing a completed task. Beside some were words like fulfilled, cleansed, accepted. There were no surnames attached to the unions, no witnesses listed, no locations beyond vague references to the grove or the inner path. It read less like a marriage record and more like a ritual log, a checklist of obedience carried out to completion. The handwriting never wavered, never showed doubt, even in the margins where notes grew more personal. The pastor wrote of dreams received after fasting, of commands given in silence, of purity requiring removal rather than protection. What made the ledger truly chilling was its consistency. Each entry followed the same structure, suggesting repetition, planning, and a belief that this process was divinely mandated. The crossed-out names did not appear mourned or regretted. They were resolved. Finished. As if the individuals themselves no longer mattered once their purpose had been served. The reader realized then that the daughters had not merely been married off, they had been recorded, processed, and spiritually concluded. The discovery spread quietly among a small circle of townspeople who understood the danger of open accusation. Fear of retaliation mixed with disbelief. Some argued that the ledger was symbolic, misunderstood by those lacking faith. Others could not reconcile its cold precision with the pastor's gentle public demeanor. No one dared confront him directly. The ledger was returned to its hiding place, not out of respect, but terror, as if removing it might draw attention from the man who had written it. After that, the chapel felt different. Every sermon carried an unspoken echo of those pages beneath the floor. Each mention of purity sounded transactional, conditional. The ledger existed as proof not only of what had been done, but of how carefully it had been justified, and once its presence was known, it became impossible to believe that the disappearances were accidents, miracles, or misunderstandings, because the truth had been written down, crossed out, and sealed beneath the very place where the pastor preached salvation. The forest had always been dense, dark, and unwelcoming to outsiders, but over time it seemed to shift in response to the pastor's presence, as if the trees themselves were complicit in the secret unfolding beneath their branches. Paths that had once led clearly through the woods began to twist unexpectedly. Travelers reported that familiar trails looped back on themselves, sending them in circles until night fell and panic took hold. Lanterns swung on crooked poles appeared in places no human had built them, casting long, trembling shadows that moved with a consciousness of their own. Even seasoned hunters spoke in hushed tones of feeling eyes on them, of hearing whispers among the leaves that made their skin crawl. The pastor's influence over the forest was subtle but pervasive. He often preached about the sacredness of isolation, claiming that the trees were God's own protectors, shielding purity from corruption. His voice seemed to carry farther than it should, bending around trunks and rocks in a way that unsettled those who tried to follow it. Those who dared to venture too close to the chapel alone found themselves disoriented, sometimes spending hours retracing the same stretch of land, as if the forest itself were rearranging to keep its secrets. People began to believe the woods were alive, guided by the pastor's will, responding to his intentions as much as to the wind and rain. The structures he built in the forest added to the sense of manipulation. Small cabins, invisible from main paths, seemed to appear suddenly, their presence confirmed only when one stumbled upon them by accident or misfortune. Lanterns swayed from unseen posts. Prayer rugs and hymn sheets were found in clearings where no one claimed to have left them. The air carried faint incense or smoke at times, marking areas that were both sacred and forbidden. The pastor called these places holy, teaching that the daughters' unions were consecrated here, beyond the understanding of ordinary eyes, and that only God could witness what transpired. Neighbors and travelers grew reluctant to enter the woods. Children were forbidden to stray, and adults hesitated to check on missing daughters or wandering flocks. Even the livestock seemed wary of the shadows beneath the trees, refusing to graze near areas where the pastor had been. Stories circulated of people who had chased a sound or glimpsed a figure in the distance only to find themselves lost for hours, returned with little memory of the way they had come, and with a creeping unease that did not fade with sunlight. It became increasingly clear that the forest was not just a backdrop but an active participant in the pastor's plan. It concealed and redirected, protected and punished, and in doing so ensured that the girls' disappearances remained a mystery, that witnesses were disoriented and fearful, and that the pastor's authority extended beyond the chapel and into every shadowed corner of the surrounding trees. The woods, once simply wild, had become a labyrinth of obedience, secrecy, and quiet terror, shaping reality itself to maintain a truth that could not be seen or questioned. The traveling skeptic arrived in the settlement under the guise of curiosity, claiming he was a student of theology and folklore, but his mind carried suspicion rather than faith. He listened to the pastor's sermons with polite attentiveness, noting the way the congregation nodded in unison, how their smiles trembled at the edges, how their hands clutched one another as if holding onto something fragile. The words themselves were unremarkable at first, familiar phrases about purity, obedience, and the trials of the righteous. But beneath the surface, he felt a current of something darker, a certainty that the pastor's authority extended beyond doctrine and into control, and that those closest to him were living under a pressure no scripture should demand. It was on a Sunday evening that the skeptic first heard the confession. The chapel was nearly empty, the congregation sparse and hesitant, and the pastor's voice carried in a lower, almost intimate register. He spoke not to the crowd but as if addressing the shadows themselves, recounting a vision, naming sins that seemed too precise to be metaphorical. One word, one fleeting detail about a daughter, caught the skeptic's attention, so small that others might have dismissed it as sermon illustration. But he recognized it instantly, a truth revealed under the guise of spiritual teaching, a confession masked in allegory. His heart quickened. The pastor had let something slip, something that was not meant to be heard. From that moment, the skeptic listened more closely, attending each sermon, visiting the outskirts of the chapel, and observing the girls under the pastor's direction. He took careful notes, cataloguing inconsistencies, and watching how the pastor's words shaped behavior. The girls moved with a strange synchronization, their responses almost rehearsed, their silence weighted with obedience. He noticed the forest's subtle interventions, the way paths seemed to shift when he tried to follow them, the lanterns that appeared in unexpected places, the whispers in the trees that made it hard to concentrate. The woods themselves seemed to conspire with the pastor, as if even nature had been enlisted in maintaining secrecy. The skeptic tried to engage the townspeople, but they were unwilling or unable to acknowledge what he suspected. Fear had taken root so deeply that even suggestion of wrongdoing felt like blasphemy. He began to understand that knowledge alone would not protect the daughters or reveal the full truth. The pastor's influence was woven into the fabric of the town, into the rhythms of daily life, into the very air of the forest. Observation became his only tool, and yet every glimpse he caught left him more unsettled, more certain that what he was witnessing could not be dismissed as simple piety, and that the deeper he probed, the more dangerous his pursuit would become. The hidden chapel was discovered almost by accident, a structure so perfectly obscured by the surrounding woods that it seemed to emerge only when one was not looking for it. The skeptic had followed a narrow path, marked by faint lantern light and footprints long faded, hoping to glimpse something tangible, some proof of the whispered rumors. The trees thickened, their branches knotted overhead, and the air grew heavier, scented faintly with damp earth and the faint smoke of burning herbs. There, between two ancient oaks, he saw the outline of a building that had no name, no indication it existed, and yet its walls bore the weight of secrecy. The chapel itself was small, constructed from dark timber, its roof low and sagging. Windows were few, their glass clouded and warped, letting in only enough light to illuminate the interior with a ghostly haze. Inside, the pews were arranged in concentric rows, as if the congregation were meant to focus not outward but toward the center, where a small altar rested. The altar was scarred, pocked with scratches, and darkened in places where wax and other substances had soaked into the wood. Symbols were etched into its surface, unfamiliar, angular, and precise, a language known only to the pastor and the daughters who had vanished. The air hummed faintly, charged with some lingering energy, the residue of countless rituals performed in secrecy. On a shelf behind the altar, the skeptic found recordings, brittle tape reels with labels written in a careful hand. The scripts were hymns, prayers, and whispered confessions, documented as if to preserve them beyond memory. Playing the tapes revealed the pastor's voice layered over itself, chanting, questioning, commanding. The daughters' voices appeared occasionally, subdued, obedient, almost mechanical. Listening, it was impossible to tell whether they were reciting willingly or under compulsion. Their cadence had the rhythm of memorized devotion but the hollow weight of fear. Each reel was a record not only of ritual but of control, a chronicle of what had been hidden from the world outside the trees. The skeptic noticed signs that the chapel had been maintained meticulously, almost obsessively. Dust was swept carefully from corners, the altar polished in places, left raw in others. Candles were stacked in careful alignment, some burned down to nubs, others freshly trimmed. It was as if the space itself had memory, responding to the presence of the pastor, preserving his intentions. The forest seemed to absorb the chapel's energy, carrying sound in strange ways, amplifying some words and silencing others. It was a place where obedience was measured not by human eyes but by unseen forces that bent reality to the pastor's will. Realizing the significance of what he had found, the skeptic understood that this hidden chapel was more than a building. It was the epicenter of the pastor's authority, the heart of the rituals that had erased the daughters from ordinary life, and the place where divine purity, as he claimed it, had been enacted in full, far from scrutiny and beyond interference. The daughter who returned came like a shadow stepping out of a story that no one wanted to finish. She appeared at the edge of the settlement one evening, walking silently along a path that had shifted over the years, as if the forest itself had finally decided to release her. Her clothes were simple, darkened with dust and wear, her hair tangled and unkempt, and her eyes carried a hollowness that made neighbors turn away instinctively. She spoke little, answering only in clipped sentences, her voice flat and measured, as though each word had been rehearsed and then forgotten in the delivery. Yet even in silence, she radiated a weight of truth the town had long refused to face. The pastor received her return with a mixture of calmness and calculation. His smile was small, measured, and almost imperceptibly pleased. He claimed that her presence proved divine favor, that she had been tested and returned stronger for it. But those who watched saw something else, fear and resignation beneath the surface, the subtle tremor of someone forced to carry secrets that could shatter everything. He allowed her to speak only in fragments, framing each statement as evidence of obedience, as if the narrative itself belonged to him, and she were merely the instrument through which it unfolded. Her revelations, however partial, sent ripples through the settlement. She spoke of the hidden chapel, of rituals performed in the forest, of nights filled with prayers that were also commands, of a ledger that recorded obedience and erased identity. Each word she uttered, though careful, made the townspeople uneasy. What had been whispered in rumors now had a name, a place, a pattern that could not be ignored. Yet many still hesitated to act, paralyzed by fear of the pastor's authority and the forest that seemed to bend to his will. The daughter herself seemed haunted, her memories fragmented, overlaid with repetition and ritual. She described being moved from one hidden location to another, participating in ceremonies meant to sanctify obedience and erase resistance. Her account was neither linear nor complete, leaving gaps that the imagination could not help but fill with dread. She spoke of the isolation, the constant monitoring, the forest that shifted around her as if it were alive, shaping her every movement and ensuring that the outside world remained unreachable. Even those who listened closely could not separate fact from the haze of indoctrination and fear. Her presence forced a reckoning the town had long avoided. The carefully maintained illusion of divine order faltered as the truth of coercion, secrecy, and manipulation seeped into everyday life. Her return illuminated the boundaries between faith and control, devotion and oppression. What she revealed, even in fragments, suggested that the pastor's authority had been absolute, that obedience had been engineered, and that the daughters' lives had been meticulously erased under the guise of holiness. The settlement could no longer pretend that the disappearances had been blessings. Reality, carried in her hollowed eyes and measured words, pressed unrelentingly against the walls of the forest, demanding acknowledgement. By the time scrutiny fell upon the pastor, the fragile veneer of his authority had already begun to crack, though not in a way that was immediately visible. From the pulpit, he still preached with the same calm certainty, quoting scripture, reciting visions, and speaking of divine purpose. To the untrained eye, he remained devout, unwavering, and wholly committed to the purity of his flock. Yet the moments between sermons, the half-glances exchanged with the daughters, and the faint hesitation in his instructions revealed fissures that suggested coercion rather than inspiration. What had once been framed as sacred obedience began to reveal itself as manipulation, control wielded with the precision of someone who believed every act was justified by providence. The town began to notice the inconsistencies first in whispers, then in small, unignorable details. Stories didn't match up. Certain rituals described by the daughters conflicted with what the pastor recited in sermons. Hymns that had once been communal were now practiced alone or in secrecy. Those who had previously acquiesced out of respect or fear now questioned why obedience required such concealment. The ledger, if its existence was known, became a symbol of more than devotion. It was proof of a system that had erased individuality in the name of divinity. Crossed-out names no longer seemed symbolic, they seemed deliberate, a methodical marking of lives dictated by a man who equated control with piety. The pastor's doctrine, once unassailable in its simplicity, began to fracture under the scrutiny of attentive observers. The skeptic who had lingered on the outskirts of the community now had corroborating evidence, patterns of disappearances, altered accounts from returning daughters, and the chilling weight of the ledger and hidden chapel. Confronted indirectly by careful questions or skeptical remarks, the pastor's calm demeanor faltered in imperceptible ways. A slip of phrasing, a hesitation in eye contact, or a slight tightening of the jaw revealed that the carefully constructed narrative of divine purity was not as flawless as he claimed. Even within the home, the daughters' compliance showed cracks. Their obedience was still outwardly precise, yet there were moments, tiny, fleeting, that betrayed confusion, fear, or defiance. The rituals that had seemed sacred and absolute now appeared oppressive, a machinery of control disguised as holiness. The town, long hesitant to challenge him, began to understand that the pastor's vision of divine order had relied less on spiritual guidance and more on domination, fear, and secrecy. The revelation was unsettling, for it meant that the very acts deemed sacred, the disappearances, the unions, the whispered blessings, were not divine interventions but orchestrations of a man whose belief in his own righteousness had overridden empathy, morality, and human dignity, and that the truth, once glimpsed, would be impossible to ignore. As the final ceremony approached, the woods themselves seemed to sense the gravity of what was about to unfold, their shadows stretching longer, the air thickening with anticipation. The pastor moved with deliberate calm, preparing every detail with an intensity that left no room for error. Paths through the forest were cleared and then obscured, lanterns placed to illuminate the way yet shrouded in fog and shadow, and the hidden chapel ready to receive those who would witness, willingly or not, the culmination of years of secrecy. The forest had become an accomplice, shaping perception, concealing evidence, and amplifying the pastor's authority, and it now seemed poised to seal the town in the web of ritual that had been woven for so long. The daughters, pale and silent, were arrayed in garments that seemed both ceremonial and confining, each stitch a reminder of obedience, each fold a boundary drawn by the pastor's vision of purity. Their eyes, once bright and curious, were now measured and trained to meet neither neighbor nor passerby with recognition. Even so, there was an undercurrent of resistance, subtle but palpable, a tremor in posture or hesitation in movement that betrayed the cost of the control imposed upon them. The pastor acknowledged none of it, treating their presence as a fulfillment of sacred purpose, a demonstration of divine order executed with precision. Neighbors who had remained distant now watched with a mixture of dread and fascination. Whispers of the ledger, the hidden chapel, and the daughters' prior absences had reached them, and the forest seemed to funnel all attention toward the clearing where the ceremony was to take place. Every footstep, every hushed exclamation, was swallowed by the thick canopy, the trees acting as sentinels for a secret that could not survive scrutiny but could not be entirely hidden either. The tension was almost tangible, the congregation, both willing and unwilling, felt the oppressive weight of expectation pressing down from above, as if even the wind were complicit in the pastor's design. As the ritual began, it became apparent that this was no ordinary ceremony. Words, gestures, and positions were executed with meticulous care, each designed to reinforce the pastor's doctrine and consolidate his control. Hymns carried through the forest, distorted by the trees, transforming familiar sounds into eerie echoes that unsettled the onlookers. Every element, from the positioning of candles to the alignment of the girls, was orchestrated to enforce a narrative of divine sanction while simultaneously erasing individuality and agency. By the ceremony's zenith, the tension between faith and fear reached its peak. The pastor's authority, once absolute, was now on display in full, yet cracks had begun to show in both him and the witnesses. Those present understood, even if only instinctively, that this event would define the settlement forever. It was not merely a ritual, it was the final convergence of secrecy, manipulation, and devotion, a reckoning that the forest and the town could not contain, a moment in which the truth, long obscured, demanded acknowledgement even as the pastor tried to sanctify it beyond question.